morning, folks. You're very welcome to Bandido Talks. Look at this. I found myself a little hidey hole in among all the vegetation. Feels very primitive in this little location. You know, I don't think the birds are too happy. They are giving me a lot of abuse, as you can probably hear. Fucking crows. But they're all part of nature. I wouldn't want to do away with the crows. But you're going to have to put up with all of their disapproval of me doing this little lessons in nature here this morning. And you know, the topic that we're going to talk about, folks, I think you could only talk about this topic in nature, to be quite honest with you. It's the type of topic that you would expect to arise in a conversation when you're out among the sticks, out among the leaves, all the greenery. What is it that we're going to talk about, folks? Well, we're going to talk about a little change in perspective, perhaps, using words. We're going to try and use words to maybe just look at the world slightly differently. Because, you know, how often do you hear people say, oh, well, life is a problem to solve. There are things in life that are problems that need to be solved. We do hear this frequently, folks. We hear people use language in a way that phrases so many things in life, and perhaps even life itself, as a problem that needs to be solved. Do you ever notice that, folks? When you listen to people's language, and look, I'm not here to be the language police, the word police, trying to tell you what you should or should not be saying. And I don't want to give this illusion that your words are somehow, you know, making your life shit. But you know, it's sometimes nice to just reflect. Reflect on your word choice. Because sometimes your word choice can actually give you an insight into some of your limitations when it comes to analysing the world and what it is that you should be doing with your life. And so that's why I bring up this idea of people oftentimes will refer to life as a problem, or they will refer to components of life or things that are happening in life as problems. And of course, people then add the little bit on. You know, they are problems that need to be solved. And you know, look, that is one way that you could look at life. You know, these birds are possibly looking at me as a problem that needs to be solved. They're maybe scheming up there in the higher canopy, thinking, how the fuck can we get this dude with this big red thing around his head to get out of our habitat? So maybe they view me as a problem that needs to be solved. I don't know. I don't have a bird brain. Although some people may say that the Bandido's brain is eerily similar to that of a bird brain. But that's a show for a different day, perhaps. So, you know, it's easy to look at life, folks, as a problem that needs to be solved. So let's use this morning's show to try and change our perspective a little bit. We're going to use different words to try and analyse life. So instead of looking at life like a problem, instead of looking at things that happen in life as problems that need to be solved, we're going to shift our terminology a little bit. And instead of saying that life is a problem that needs to be solved, we could say that life is a mystery that we need to embrace. Now, I know a whole bunch of you are going to be saying, well, that's just a load of garbage. A load of garbage. That's just like something the tree huggers would say. The tree huggers would say, well, nature is just beautiful. We need to embrace nature. We need to hug the trees. And we need to hug everybody in life. And, you know, we need to just be self. You know, we need to give to others to the detriment of ourselves. We need to give all our money away. We just need to, you know, kumbaya, basically. Kumbaya, life is wonderful. You don't need money, you don't need anything. You know, it would be easy to start going down that line of thinking. And perhaps that's what you're thinking as I say this. Life is a mystery that needs or should be embraced, as opposed to life being a problem that needs to be solved. You may think, whenever you hear that little adjustment, you may then think, well, you know, now it's all about hugging the trees and throwing away all your money and, you know, not playing life according to the rules that have been set out in front of you, according to government and civilization and all of this stuff. That's not what I'm saying, folks. I'm not saying that you should be ignorant of what's happening around you and that you should just embrace, you know, the bag of shite that's sitting in front of you. You know, you don't have to go up to the bag of shite and hug the bag of shite and say this is wonderful. That's not what I'm saying. But you know, let me tell you how this is relevant, what I'm saying. Let me tell you, or try to explain, why this little quote, or this little change in perspective, which I did not create, by the way. We're going to do a live show later this week on YouTube. I'm almost sure I'm going to do this live show. We're going to do a live show about two individuals. One is a real person, one is a fictional person. And I'm not going to spoil it, but the real person that we're going to talk about in this live show came up with this quote, not me. So tune in to our live show on YouTube this week, and you'll hear me talking all about this real person who actually came up with this quote, or this perspective, and then we'll be talking about a fictional person too. It'll be a good show. But I did not create this perspective. I heard it a few weeks ago, and I thought, isn't that interesting? Instead of viewing life, because scientists, folks, and science in particular, we've talked a lot about this on the show recently, science has a tendency to view life as a problem, and we're trying to solve all of these problems in life. You know, all of these things that don't make sense, like consciousness and all of this stuff. The brain, is it machines all the way down? Is consciousness, is there more to consciousness? And you know, even in our own lives, we can just look at life as a whole bunch of problems that need to be solved. And I don't per se have a problem with that mindset. If you feel that that makes you more competitive to view life that way, then you fire away. But we're going to do a little bit of thinking this morning. We're going to consider this other option. Instead of viewing life as one big problem that has to be solved, we should view it perhaps as a mystery that ought to be embraced. Now let me explain why this is relevant. And it's not just some fucking hippie speak that I'm coming out with, that we just need to embrace everything and, you know, basically be self-sacrificial. And, you know, not worry about the fact that, you know, we need money and, you know, you want to get in a position of power in life so that you're able to move, change up your geographical location. You know what? I don't want us to wander into that territory. That's now wandering into the land of the delusional. But let me explain why this little quote, this little perspective, is relevant. You know, at the moment, and I've talked about this a few times before, folks, on the show, I am currently in the process of writing a novel. It's a fictional novel, a fictional story. And I've got the draft done. And I'm sort of in the process of editing. And an interesting thing has happened in the last few weeks. As I've been going through this draft, it's 160,000 words. That's how long the story is. 160,000 words. I'm going down through this draft, and I'm starting to edit the draft. And I'm starting to encounter some problems with the story, with the narrative, with the mechanics of the world that I'm trying to build. Now, we could call these problems, and for a long time, I would have viewed them as such. I would have viewed these little snags, these little problems that are arising in the draft, in the world that I'm trying to build. I would view them as problems. And I'd be thinking, I need a solution to these problems so that my story makes more sense. There aren't any plot holes in the story. There aren't any gaps in the logic of what it is that I'm trying to build. So for most of the time that I've been writing this book, and by the way, folks, I have been writing this book since 2014. 12 years I have been writing this thing. And I've been going back and forth. And when I say back and forth, I've been going back and forth with this idea of, should there be a sci-fi, supernatural, magic component to the story? Or should I just keep the story within the realms of what we define currently as reality? And I've been going back and forth. And so now I've decided that, why would I keep my story within the realm of what we call reality when we don't understand the world around us, when we don't fully understand this reality? So I'm allowing my brain, I'm allowing my imagination now to fully, let's just say, explore the possibilities of how I can make my story more expansive, beyond what we conventionally know in science, beyond what we conventionally know in this reality, and how it works, and the universe as a whole. So now what I'm doing is I'm exploring this more imaginative element to the story, this element of magic, as we would call it, science fiction. It's not, quote, verified by science at the moment. And I'm exploring this. But naturally, folks, as I explore, using my imagination, all of these possibilities for the story, what naturally happens? Well, I'm trying to build a world. I'm trying to build this fictional world in the story. And the underlying mechanics of this fictional world do have a sci-fi, magic, supernatural component. But in order to make this work and to make the story interesting, the mechanics have to line up. There can't be contradictions, in other words, in the mechanics of the story. Think of it as an example. Think of Inception by Christopher Nolan. Think of that movie. You know that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Michael Caine and all of those guys. Think of Inception. In order for Christopher Nolan to make a movie like that, and for it to be as successful as it was, and as intriguing as it was, he needed to make sure that the mechanics of the dream world that he was building, because that's what Inception is. Spoiler! 3 seconds to plug your ears if you don't want to hear any Inception spoilers. 1, 2, 3, you've been warned. The dream world that Nolan is trying to create, it has very complex, what we would call, mechanics. In other words, how the dream world works in Inception is very complicated. This idea of the kick, this idea of going deeper into the dream state, planting an idea, extracting information from someone's mind, it's very complicated. And for Nolan to be able to pull this movie off, he needed to make sure that the mechanics made sense throughout the movie. And I remember hearing interview with Nolan, with Christopher Nolan, the director and the writer of Inception. And he said that he actually had a lot of the script ready in 2002. Now, he didn't actually release the movie until 2010, I believe. Maybe it was 2011, I can't exactly remember. But the point is, a large amount of time passed from when he had the original idea until he released the completed movie. Why? Well, the reason why was back in 2002, when Christopher Nolan had this idea for Inception, he couldn't make the mechanics of the world make sense. In other words, everything wasn't adding up. it wasn't cohesive. And so as a result, he couldn't complete the movie. And he had to let basically 8 years pass until he was able to finally work out, that's how I can make this, and this makes sense. And now the movie flows. There isn't a plot hole. There isn't a gap in the logic of the mechanics. Now I'm facing a similar thing with my own story. I've got this sort of complicated world that I'm building. And the underlying mechanics of the world, just like Inception. Now I'm not saying I'm Christopher Nolan. Please don't mistake me. Don't think the Bandido's ego has got out of control. I'm not saying I'm Christopher Nolan. I'm not saying my story is as good as Inception's. But the point is, the underlying mechanics of my story are complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so I'm now in the process of trying to work out how I can make all the mechanics that underpin this world make sense. Because if there's gaps in how the logic of things work, then it doesn't really make the story terribly enjoyable, because the reader will be able to say, well, that doesn't make sense. It's like Harry Potter. Same thing. When J.K. Rowling, how do you pronounce her name? J.K. Rowling, I'm going to say. When J.K. Rowling is writing Harry Potter, the underlying mechanics of the magical world are complicated. There's a lot of complicated stuff in there. And she had to make sure that everything was in agreement, that everything made sense. Otherwise, the story loses some credibility. Because it seems like you're just making stuff up. And one thing that you've said in the second book doesn't really agree with something you've said in the fifth book, and there's no real, cohesiveness to the entire series. And so obviously J.K. Rowling did an excellent job tying up all the mechanics that underpin the magical world in which Harry Potter flourishes. It's no different for me. Now, why am I saying all of this? I'm saying all of this because when you start to get into a creative process like this, and you're trying, in my case, to create this fictional world with very complicated mechanics that underpin the world, it's very tempting to look at all of this as problems. Every time you meet a snag, every time I've met a snag, when I've been writing this story, when I've been trying to develop the world, it would have been easy. And in the past, I have actually done this. I have viewed every snag as a problem that needs to be solved. So up until relatively recently, I've been looking at my book through the perspective of a problem to be solved. It's a problem to be solved. The things that are happening in my story, the parts of the story that don't add up, that aren't making sense, that are contradicting one another, I have been viewing those as problems that I've needed to find a solution to, that I've needed to solve. Now, here's the interesting thing. When I heard this real person who I'm going to talk about on our live show this week, when I've been listening to this person, and I've been listening to a few of his podcasts, and he's a philosopher. He's a philosopher and a psychiatrist who's very interested in consciousness and how the brain works. In particular, how the left and right hemisphere work. And anybody who is steeped in this world may know who I'm talking about. But I'll leave the live show later this week as a surprise. So this philosopher slash psychiatrist slash brain researcher, consciousness researcher, he came up with this perspective, not me. And whenever I heard him say this on this little podcast that I was listening to of him, he said, life is not a problem to be solved, it's a mystery to be embraced. And when he said that, it immediately resonated with me. In particular, it resonated with me with regards to my story, with regards to my novel. And it unlocked this hidden creativity that I didn't realize was actually present. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, instead of me looking at my novel as one big problem that needs to be solved, I started looking at my novel as this mystery that is not yet complete. There are things that I don't know about the story. There are things that I'm going to discover about the story, and instead of me trying to view it as a big problem that I need to solve, that I need to find the solution to, instead of viewing it that way, I'm now viewing it as this mystery that I'm now embracing each day. It may sound like it doesn't make a big difference, folks, but it really has made a big difference for the way in which I'm creatively approaching this project. Because instead of racking my brain trying to find a solution to a problem, I'm just allowing the story to greet me on its terms. I'm allowing the story to just seep into my mind. And I'm allowing my mind to be open to whatever it is that I'm going to discover. And I'm embracing that, and I'm working with it, instead of working against it. Because this is the thing, folks. When you view life as a problem that needs to be solved, when you view things in life as problems that need to be solved, what this can lead to, folks, and this is very relevant to our most recent mind stream, episode 6, I believe. Learning from a dying father. And what was the little subtitle to that mind stream episode? You can find it on the channel. I would encourage you to go and watch it. The little subtitle was, Never Be Desperate. Desperation, folks, is not a good thing. Desperation normally leads to suboptimal decision making. When you're in a desperate state, you tend to do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. You can oftentimes, normally, desperation will lead to your emotions completely clouding your judgment. And if we're talking about probabilities, folks, when the emotions cloud the judgment, you're more likely to make a mistake. Because you're needy, because you're desperate, you're trying to solve something, in other words. And you can start to develop this neediness, this desperation to find the solution. And that's what the link is here, folks. This is why this little perspective shift is important. I'm not saying you have to do it, but it's just an interesting and perhaps important way, we could argue, to look at life. Because the more you start to view life as a problem that needs to be solved, and things in life as problems that need to be solved, the more likely you are to become desperate, to become needy, to find the answers to these things. And what will oftentimes start to happen, you'll start to look for answers and conjure up answers that are actually moving you further away from the truth, moving you further away from an optimal decision that will actually enhance your existence. You start looking for things that aren't there because you're just looking desperately in needy fashion to find any answer, any solution that will satisfy or at least superficially resolve the problem. And this is why, folks, I personally am moving away from this idea of viewing life and life's things, the things that happen in life, as problems. I'm moving away from that because what I notice in my own past history and also through observing other people, when those people who classify life as a problem or things in life as problems that need to be solved, what I have observed in myself and in other people is that there's an increasing amount of desperation and neediness that build up in people's minds as they try to force a solution. Because this is what happens when you get needy and you get desperate. You try to force a solution. Because when the solution isn't coming, your desperation increases, your neediness increases. And as those start to increase, you become increasingly, your judgment becomes increasingly clouded to the point where you force a solution that actually isn't there. You find an answer that isn't actually the truth. But you think it's a solution. Because you're just so desperate to find some way to explain what it is that you're seeing. You're just so desperate to find a resolution to this thing that you force a solution. You force an answer. And you dig your trench. And you just keep digging. And then before you know it, you're 1,000 feet under the ground. And there's no more light anymore. And you're in the dark. That's what desperation can lead to. That's what neediness can lead to. And desperation and neediness can literally arise out of this perspective of viewing life and things in life as problems that need to be solved. Now, if we use our other perspective, instead of viewing things in life as problems to be solved, if we look at these things as mysteries that we ought to embrace, notice how, folks, with that perspective, you see the neediness and the desperation that can lead to a forced solution or can lead to a forced answer to help try and explain something. Notice how those things just dissolve away. The neediness dissolves away, the desperation dissolves away. Because instead of fighting against something, instead of trying to force a solution or an answer that isn't really there to help explain something, you're just embracing what is. You're acknowledging the fact that you don't know. That's why I use the word mystery. You're acknowledging that you don't know, you don't fully understand what it is that you're looking at, but you're willing to embrace it. What is that code for, folks? That is code for being open to other possibilities and allowing your imagination to be this broad, expansive savanna, this broad, expansive plain that's just ripe for exploration. You're opening the possibilities. You're not looking at problems to be solved. You're looking at this thing that we're going to call a mystery that you don't fully understand, but you're happy to keep your mind open and your imagination active and your curiosity active to whatever is going to greet you. In other words, you're happy to embrace whatever comes your direction. You're not digging a hole. You're not digging your trench. Oh, well, I've forced the solution now. My desperation and neediness has forced an answer or a solution to this problem. And you're satisfied with it, and down you go. You start digging your trench. Before you know it, you're 1,000 feet under, and you're in the dark. Instead, when you view life as a mystery that ought to be embraced, you maintain your curiosity, you maintain your openness, you maintain an expansive imagination. And lo and behold, folks, to bring this back around to my story, what do you think has happened in the last few weeks? Instead of me viewing these snags, these things in the story that aren't making sense as problems, I now view them as mysteries that I ought to embrace. And by me shifting this perspective, shifting into this perspective, it has allowed me, and I can only speak from personal experience, believe me or not, I can only tell you that it has unlocked a whole bunch of dormant creativity. And the reason why I believe this has happened is because as I was trying to solve the problems, I was becoming increasingly needy and desperate for an answer. I was becoming increasingly needy and desperate for a solution. And this increasing neediness and desperation was leading me to forcing things into my story that shouldn't have been there. I was forcing solutions to the problems. But they weren't really the solutions because they were forced. They weren't organic. I wasn't embracing what the story actually is. What is the story trying to tell me? Instead of me trying to tell the story what to be, what is the story telling me? And I've started to apply this to my own songwriting as well. You can apply this to any creative process, folks. Now, whenever I'm writing music, instead of trying to through this needy desperation, try to force the great bridge, the great middle eight. Instead of trying to force a great lyric, I just look at the piece of music. I accept that it's a mystery. I accept that I don't fully understand it yet, and perhaps I never will. But I'm going to embrace whatever it brings my direction. And I'm going to work with it. Instead of trying to force something into it that shouldn't be there, just so that I can say I, quote, solved the problem. Instead of just doing that, I work with it. I accept that there will be things I don't understand. Things will happen that I don't understand. But as long as I remain curious and open, and as long as my imagination is expansive and broad and open, I give myself the best shot at realizing the potential in that song or in my story. And that has been such an important thing, creatively speaking, for me. Because now I can see, as I've stopped viewing my novel, and especially the underlying mechanics of the world I'm trying to build, instead of viewing these things as problems, by me accepting that, you know what, I don't understand where my story's going. So instead of me trying to, say, I've got it, I understand that the story does this, that, and the other, instead of me taking this stance that I, quote, know, or I, quote, understand where the story's going, I'm now pulling back, and I'm saying, you know what, I don't know where this story's going. I don't know where it's going to lead to. It's a, quote, mystery to me at present. And instead of me trying to force things into the story, instead of me trying to bend the story to my will, just so that I can, quote, generate a solution to solve a problem, just so that I can tick it off and say, all right, there, it's sorted. Problem solved, next thing. Instead of me doing that, I'm going to work with the story. I'm going to embrace the story for what it is. And by embracing the story for what it is, I'm embracing the fact that I don't exactly know where it's going. I don't exactly know what the underlying mechanics of the world I'm trying to build will ultimately look like. But I'm open, I'm curious, the imagination is not shut off. I'm not digging my trench. I'm not taking a stance. I'm not forcing answers where they ought not to be forced. I'm not trying to inject solutions into, quote, problems, just so that I can say I've solved the problem. This is why, folks, I would encourage you to watch the most recent Mind Stream, Episode 6, Lessons from a Dying Father. Never be desperate. This little Lessons in Nature is a very complimentary episode for that. This is why, folks, I said in that Mind Stream, I never put myself in a state of desperation in life. Never. Because desperation and neediness only, or probably when we talk probabilities, they are most likely to only end up leading me to one place, which is emotions clouding my judgment and me forcing solutions and making decisions that are suboptimal. That is ultimately where desperation and neediness will probably lead. And when you're making bad decisions, you're probably making mistakes. And so who's losing out? You and I. And it's interesting because until I listened to this philosopher, this psychiatrist, this brain researcher, this consciousness researcher, who I am going to do a show on, along with another little fictional character, later on in the week. Stay tuned for who it is I'm talking about. But this person, as I've been listening to them, and I came across this little quote, or this little perspective that they have. Life is not a problem to be solved. Rather, it is a mystery to be embraced. As soon as he said that, I was able to draw the connection between the perspective of a mystery that should be embraced and neediness and desperation. There's a clear link between the two, to me. When you increasingly view life and the things in life as problems to be solved, you are literally increasing, and perhaps you don't even realize it. I didn't realize it. You don't realize that the degree to which you're becoming desperate and needy for an answer to the thing. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about consciousness. You know, there are people in the world who think that, you know, the brain is just, consciousness just emerges from the brain, and when the brain dies, so does consciousness. People think that consciousness is just an emergent property of the brain. There are other people who think there's more to consciousness than that. But you see, what you don't want to do, folks, it doesn't matter which side of the spectrum you're lying on here. The world is becoming very, we could say, polarized. And what I mean by that is, people feel like they have to take extreme positions and then dig their trench 1,000 feet deep. They have to maintain that position for the rest of their living hours. And this idea of viewing life as a problem to be solved, it can lead, and I've noticed this in myself and others, it can lead to an increasing amount of neediness and desperation. And whenever you become sufficiently needy and desperate, you end up forcing answers to things in life, such as, is consciousness an emergent property of the brain, or is there more to consciousness? What you'll find people doing, or, for example, me with my story, or any other creative person, a songwriter or whatever, what you'll notice is, as people become increasingly needy and desperate in order to solve a problem, what they end up doing, inevitably, is they force a solution. It may not objectively be the right answer. It may not objectively be the right solution. In fact, it probably isn't the right solution. But people will do whatever they can to just force an answer, force a solution, so that they can just tick it off and basically confirm what it is that they think about the world. Confirm what it is that they think, or confirm how it is that they think the world actually works. As long as they can just force the answer, force the solution, and maintain their current worldview, they're happy. In other words, they're happy to just dig their trench. And so that's the lesson here, as we're out in nature this morning. As we're out here, folks, among the sticks, among the leaves, the birds, you know, they've started to quiet down a little bit, haven't they? They were very loud earlier on. But as we're out here, folks, that is the lesson. I'm not telling you how to think. I'm not telling you which perspective to adopt in life. But what I would say is at least consider life not to be a problem that requires a solution. At least try to not simply summarize things in life as problems that need solutions, problems that need to be solved. Try to have a look at life more like a mystery, and the things in life as mysteries that ought to be embraced. And who knows, folks, maybe like me, I don't know your own life circumstances, but maybe like me, you might unlock something interesting. I've unlocked something interesting in my story. Something that I simply, for the last 12 years that I've been writing this damn thing, I have never quite had the creative outburst that I've had in the last few weeks. Because instead of trying to force solutions to problems that I deemed were present, I've now viewed the entire project as a mystery that I don't fully understand. But it's a mystery that I'm willing to embrace. I'm willing to work with it. I'm willing to allow the story to tell me how it wants to be written, as opposed to me bending it to my will. And I don't know, folks, maybe in your own life, you can apply this little phrase, this little perspective in some similar way, and maybe you can extract some similar benefit that I have. The power, folks, is literally in your own mind. The question is, how open do you want your mind to be? How curious do you want to remain? And how expansive do you want your imagination to be?